Good afternoon, everyone. So, the second Payment Services Directive, or PSD2, for anyone in payments has been something at the front of our minds, and even more so with the deployment of strong customer authentication and the European deadline of the end of last year. Then in the UK, more specifically, the Financial Conduct Authority, or FCA, actually delayed the deployment of SCA until March 2022. So there are many things that businesses need to be ready for in terms of their compliance endeavors. And do they look at this deployment in a more strategic way? Is this a compliance exercise? So we're going to explore all of these issues. And today it is my pleasure to welcome Dave Gordon, Senior Product Owner at Nationwide Building Society, who's been managing this program for Nationwide and certainly very heavily involved with the regulators. So Dave, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks Neira. Hi, everybody. So as Neira said, I'm David Gordon. I work as a Senior Product Owner for Nationwide Building Society in the UK, and I've been a part of our internal program to manage the rollout of strong customer authentication across all of our relevant in-scope services over the last few years. Looking forward to having a chat with you today about the issues that are facing the industry at the moment.
Thanks, David. It's always a pleasure to be talking to an expert. So, straight on, when the FCA introduced the 18-month SCA delay to March 2022, many businesses breathed a sigh of relief. But why were financial services institutions so relieved? Is it because it would give them the opportunity to be more strategic in their authentication strategies?
Well, I think the most important thing in all this, and in the kind of the essence of that delay was, excuse me, that this gave us an opportunity to better manage the risk to the industry and particularly to our customers, rushing this important piece of regulation, which ultimately is there to make customers' lives safer. But causing them harm in the process was not going to be a sensible way for the industry to go. So I think the sigh of relief was particularly around being able to do that in a more controlled manner, and to protect the outcomes of customers through the process of implementing these regulations. It's a hugely complex exercise. We've already gone through a number of complex stages to get to this point across, digital banking services. Now the focus is mainly on the e-commerce space, and experience from those previous phases has helped understand the level of complexity and the work that needs to go into making sure that these changes land in a way that doesn't impact customers' experiences and the outcomes that we're seeking to protect. So I think that was the main reason for the sigh of relief, rather than an opportunity to think more strategically. And I think there are two different institutions will have different challenges, but there are two common ones that tend to are binding the industry at the moment and are at the forefront of most people's minds, and that is those people that are reliant or using one-time passcode authentications for e-commerce authentication, what second factor goes with that, and implementing that in time for the regulatory deadline. And just the general ramp up and switch on of SCA rules, making sure that all payments are processed in a compliant way, and working with the UK finance, the team in UK finance in the UK, to ensure that we all work on to a coordinated plan. And again, that plan's all about managing risks and protecting customer outcomes. So having more time on those two issues to make sure that they're managed through in a controlled way, I think was the biggest reason that that sense of relief that you mentioned was pertinent.
So that's very interesting, and of course made even more difficult by the increase in e-commerce and digital activity in general, as driven by the pandemic over the last 2 years. So disruption, as you say, is not welcome. So what I'm hearing from you, Dave, is that the focus was on compliance so as to avoid disruption as much as we could. But could you explain to us what the problems are for financial services institution when it comes to reaching a compliance baseline without disrupting customers?
Yeah, of course. So I think if we come back to those two issues that I sort of outlined at the start that are fairly common across most, certainly issuing banks in the UK, around the second factor for one-time passcodes, and the ensuring that all of our payment transactions are processed in a compliant way. And I'll talk about each of those separately. So from a compliance, from a one-time passcode perspective, this has been something that the industry has been consulting on, working to find a way through, in a fairly collaborative way to understand what options are available to institutions that will meet the regulations. There are essentially two options. Obviously, one-time passcode represents a possession factor under the guidance provided by the EBA, so that needs to be accompanied by either a knowledge or an inherence factor. I think the industry has some fairly common and shared concerns around use of knowledge factors following verified by Visa passwords that were previously used in the industry and caused a lot of dropout and decline transactions during that period of time 5 or 6 years ago. So there's a certain level of reluctance to use knowledge factors to solve this problem. So a lot of work has been done across the industry to understand the viability of using inherence factors and things like behavioural biometrics, which I think we'll talk about a little bit more about later. But making that choice, and again, testing that technology and making sure, again, that whatever solution an individual issuer decides is the right one for them, ensuring that is robust, meets the requirements under the regulations, but also provides a good experience for customers. So I think that's a challenge, one challenge, and that financial services organisations are kind of using this extra time to make sure that they solve in a robust way. I think the second challenge is around ensuring that all transactions are undertaken in a compliant way. I think the latest metrics from the industry are around about 20 to 25% of transactions are currently submitted without going through authentication or without one of the recognised exemptions under the regulations. So we need to move that percentage down to zero by the 14th of March. And that is really reliant on all parties in the industry being set up and ready to operate under the rules of strong customer authentication, and particularly be able to use 3D Secure enable to authenticate transactions that need to go through that element of the process. And there are still, there are lots of moving parts to that, lots of different parties involved in that process. And if those parties don't work in a coordinated manner, then there's a real risk that harm will come and poor experiences will be had from customers across the market through high volumes of declined transactions. And everybody involved wants to avoid that. So those, I think, are probably the two main challenges that the industry is currently facing into, and over the next 6 months between now and March 14th, need to solve in an appropriate way, as I say, that protects the experience for everyone's customers.
That's interesting. So that's quite a high percentage of transactions that are submitted not in compliance with the strong customer authentication requirements. And I'm wondering why that is. I mean, what are the challenges facing those businesses submitting these transactions? I'm trying to understand that a bit more. Is it a lack of understanding of what is possible with exemptions, a lack of understanding of for example, the latest version of 3DS 2.2 work? I mean, what is it? Is it the technology? Is it the process? Is it a price issue? What is it?
I think there are probably a number of reasons, and if you think about the millions of transactions that take place across just the UK market alone every day, that in itself presents quite a high level of complexity from moving from one place or one way of moving to a different rule set of how those transactions should be processed, and so it's a complex undertaking in itself. And there are different organisations involved who have different priorities. So I don't think there's necessarily one reason, but probably different reasons for different types of organisations that are involved in that process. And I think the pandemic itself has probably played quite a big role in the position that we're in, because companies will probably have had distractions and other priorities to focus on in terms of technical development, responding to short-term challenges and short-term needs of their customers, and preparation for this regulation may have been impacted by that. So that may be affecting readiness of some organisations. There is a commercial side to it as well, particularly from a merchant perspective, where processing transactions through 3D Secure is a slightly more expensive way to process transactions, and therefore commercially it may make sense to delay that. So that again may be holding things back a little bit. But I think speaking from an issuer perspective, I think most banks have concerns around potentially the harm that could be caused to customers if this isn't done in a correct way, and not having complete control of that process and that experience in order to be able to implement that creates a high level of nervousness and a tendency to go slowly. I think the only way that the industry has a way through that is through collective action. And the key here is for everybody to try to work together to fall in line with the new regulations through coordination and communication to protect any harm that could be caused to customers through that process. Because as I alluded to before, the risks are high, and we need to make sure that those risks are managed, and no one individual entity or organisation can manage those risks on their own. It can only be done through working collectively to ensure that this change lands appropriately.
Indeed, I mean, as in any large endeavors such as this one, cooperation is absolutely essential. I'd like to explore a bit more the impact on issues such as nationwide of the industry readiness as a whole for a compliant SCA deployment. Could you tell us what that looks like?
Yes, I think so. I think this is mainly on the switch on of the SCA rules and the transaction flows. That's where the biggest risk lies. Less so in the kind of the second factor element, because I think we have quite a lot of experience now of rolling out new authentication factors. So we've got experience and learnings from that we can apply as we look to a second factor solution. So less concern around that, but it's more around, as I say, the impact around readiness of the industry. And I think what that the biggest thing that looks like, I guess, if you take it from a customer lens, is I'm trying to use my card to buy something online, and I can't do it because the transaction's not been submitted in the right way, which has nothing to do with my action as the customer, purely to do with the implementation of these rules. And somewhere in some part, somewhere along the transaction flow, someone's not doing something correctly or is not quite ready to do it in the way it needs to be done, and that will result in a decline for the customer being able to use their card, which is obviously very frustrating. So the biggest thing we're worried about is around that and the harm and dissatisfaction that can potentially cause for our customers, and that of course will then have knock-on effects. We will probably see higher levels of transactions being resubmitted, which incurs additional costs in itself, and then we'll have knock-on effects on our frontline services, and potentially has the risk of driving up high volumes of contacts into our contact centres and complaints and dissatisfaction. So we're concerned about that, and really working hard internally, but both internally and externally, to try and manage those risks as best we can over the next 6 months.
Wow, that's a tall order. So who do you think is responsible for supporting the industry as a whole to reaching an acceptable level of readiness? And do you think that enough is being done right now? Because we've only got 6 months.
Yeah. So again, I think this is a complex situation, and 6 months is not very much time to complete the rollout of these changes. And I think having seen the deadline move already, I think it's unlikely that we'll see that move again. So it is something that is requiring really focused minds at the moment, as we strive towards that March deadline. I guess answering the question directly, I don't see it as one particular body or organisation has accountability for this. It's complex in the sense that not all parties have, I guess, the regulatory obligation under the regulations. So banks and acquirers have are regulated entities, but for these regulations under the FCA, but merchants are not. So it has to be driven, I guess, first and foremost by those regulated organisations. But again, I come back to the point that everyone, actually, regardless of the regulations, the materiality of the risk really lies with the customer experience here, and getting that wrong will affect every party that is involved in the payments ecosystem. So it's really important that everyone works together. And I guess in terms of is enough being done, I don't think we could any party could sort of answer that question and say yes at the moment. I think much more needs to be done much more quickly across the industry if we're going to meet that March deadline without incurring significant harm to customers. So I think everybody needs to take more the accountability to make sure that we manage the risks that are in front of us, because a smooth rollout is in everybody's interests, because everybody has ownership of that customer relationship from a different perspective. And I think industry bodies and stuff have an important role to play to sort of help facilitate that coordination. But each of the individual organisations will have to take a level of accountability as well to make sure that, as I say, those big risks that the industry faces are managed in the right way.
Absolutely. So could you explore this a bit further, for example, so we understand that all the stakeholders have a role to play, but specifically more so with the regulated entities. So what kind of activity do you think there should be more of?
Well, I think better more levels of communication and feedback between. It's a complex. If you think there's, I think I heard that. I'm not sure the exact figure, so don't quote me on it. But something like 350,000 e-merchants in the UK. There's about 50 issuing banks. So coordinating all those people is a very difficult task. But I think trying to get better communication between each of those organisations in understanding the perspectives and the positions that those organisations are in terms of that will help to build confidence. I think at the moment, speaking from an issuing perspective, have very little understanding of merchant readiness. So therefore, that gives me, gives us as an organisation concerns around, ramping up at a particular level of pace, because we can't foresee or predict what the outcomes are going to be for our customers. So therefore, that it creates a little bit of nervous and I guess inertia in terms of going forward with the process. So I think better communication and better feedback as we go through the process between all those different stakeholders is really, really important, so that we can understand that and try to build some confidence that way. It's really important. I think it's very easy to point fingers and say this group of organisations isn't doing this and this isn't doing that, but actually we need to coerce around a common objective, which is we have to deliver. These regulations need to be delivered by the 14th of March. And as I've probably said 3 or 4 times already, it's in everyone's interest to ensure that that's done in a controlled and managed way, so that we can protect the experiences of our customers.
Thanks, Dave. And exploring a bit further on this as well, still, which is we've been talking about merchants and card payments and everything else. Is the picture different for bank payments? Since it's been 3 years since the deployment of open banking. As an issuer, you're very heavily involved in that as well personally. So is the picture different on these other rails, or is it the same?
No, I think we've gone through that process really of kind of making the changes to that process, and I think that was a bit different in the sense that from a building society perspective, we had much more control of the end-to-end of that process. So in terms of rolling out the changes, the accountability pretty much all sat with us, and we had much fewer dependencies on anybody else or any other third parties. So therefore, in terms of managing the communications with our customers around the changes that were coming, having control over, pulling back if something went wrong and that kind of thing. Like that was all much more within our control. So we had much more confidence in terms of being able to move forward and knowing that regression was within our gift. So I think the circumstances of this element of the rollout of regulations is far more complex than even some of the stuff that has already been done. And I think generally, certainly from our perspective, the changes we made to ensure that our journeys were compliant with strong customer authentication have landed fairly smoothly with our customers, and satisfaction has stayed where we wanted it to through that process. This is, as I say, is much more complex in the sense that the different number of parties involved and trying to coordinate that, and just the volume and magnitude of the organisations that are involved in ensuring that this rollout is a success.
Thank you for that. And of course, cooperation is always key, not only across industry, but across public and private sector, specifically with the regulators as well. But that's not, I guess, the only coordination problem you've had, Dave. So as an issuer, you've been on this journey for quite a while now, and with such a complex program, there are numerous stakeholders and cross-functional teams internally. So what best practice can you share with us in terms of what you've done internally to make this as smooth as possible?
Well, I think there are two things that really stand out here. And the first thing I think is making a conscious effort for the team. We've had well over 100 people working on this program at different stages, and the number of people has gone up and down as we've gone through the program. But it's a substantial project internally. And I think there can be a tendency to, when you're implementing a big regulatory change like this, to think about compliance first. And obviously compliance is essential. You need to make sure that the solutions that you deliver are obviously meet the regulations and the requirements that poses. But I think the biggest thing that stands out for me is still keeping the customer front and center, and the experience that you're creating front and center is essential. Otherwise, you run the risk of going through a process of ticking a load of boxes from a compliance perspective, but then delivering a suboptimal or a poor customer experience, which will then probably need to be fixed and refined in the future. I think that's something that we've certainly strived to do, and has been really, really, really important in terms of us delivering not only a proposition that's compliant, but a proposition which delivers a high level of customer satisfaction as well. And I think a key part of that kind of customer lens has been the communication. So making sure that customers understand and are ready for the changes that are coming, and they understand that the change is being delivered in their interests to provide a more secure experience. I think that's been really, really important for us. And I think a good example for that is we've delivered a really slick experience of authenticating via our banking app for e-commerce payments. Again, that was a brand new authentication method that we weren't using anywhere else in any of our experiences. So testing that and making sure that is kind of working for customers was kind of, I guess, an example of how that kind of trait has played through in terms of what we've delivered part of this change. It's a fully compliant authentication option, but also provides a really slick experience for customers as well. So that's probably an example of how we've kind of achieved that. And I think the second point I would make is is having really effective communications internally. This change affects and impacts all different areas of the organisation nationwide. And many different levels and types of accountability, as part of it. So having a clear and transparent governance structure in place throughout has served us really well in terms of kind of communication and decision making along the way. There's lots of different decisions that have to be made at lots of different times. Some of them you can plan for, some of them you can't plan for. Lots of moving parts all the time. So knowing that core governance structure was in place and that core group of individuals was there to consult with where decisions need to be made in perhaps a quick manner, has been really invaluable, and has ensured we've made good decisions right the way through and responded to changes in the external landscape in the right way.
So that's great. So without going into the full sort of program organizational structure, but typically, what kind of cross-disciplinary functions did you have in that core team?
Yeah, so we run the program largely out of our digital function in the core, because most of the changes were to our digital services. So it was certainly led by the digital community within Nationwide, but it spans out across our financial crime teams, obviously our payments teams, compliance, legal, and then obviously impacts on contact centres and other frontline services, our branch network. So all of those kind of stakeholders needed to be taken along on the journey with us. Some of them were much more hands-on involved in the day-to-day. Others were more interested parties, but needed to understand the changes we were making, because they'll be the ones that have to explain it to our customers. So so that gives you kind of an idea of the types of areas of our organisation that have been involved throughout the I think nearly 4 years now. We've been working on strong customer authentication.
And did you have any at any point in time direct involvement with the regulator as part of the team?
Well, yeah. So I mean, so we've worked, in terms of keeping the FCA updated with our progress. I guess not direct in the same sense as I would with internal stakeholders, but we've kept the FCA updated with our progress towards the various targets that have been in front of us as we've gone through the process.
So, in terms of technology innovation in all this, you mentioned very earlier on in our chat new technologies such as behavioral biometrics. So when it comes to strong customer authentication, there are many innovative technology that can help with compliance without disrupting the customer experience. And you mentioned one of them. And so I'd like to ask you, Dave, why did you actually choose to adopt behavioral biometrics?
Well, I guess we had big concerns around using a knowledge factor, as I sort of alluded to in one of my answers to your previous question. We shared the kind of wider concerns that have been well debated across the industry around using knowledge factors in this scenario or in this use case. So we were keen to try to avoid that if we could do so in a compliant way. I think leads nicely back to the points I've made really in terms of around customer experience throughout. I think a thread through all of my answers. This undoubtedly provides potentially, and also potentially, because we still need to validate that it works to the right standard in this use case, but it gives the right balance between providing a high a strong experience for customers, but also meeting compliance and security requirements as well. And I think most things when you think about authentication are probably a balance between those three things really. And you can choose a solution which provides you lots of security, but is a really cumbersome experience for members or for our customers, and others which are less secure and provide a brilliant experience, but you have to find a balance between those factors. And having looked at the options available, we think that behavioral biometrics provides us with that best balance, and provide us the opportunity to be compliant, provide a secure solution to customers, but also introduce limited friction and cognitive load beyond what they've already become accustomed to through using one-time passcodes. So that's why we've gone down that path.
Excellent. So when will you know that that this actually meets your requirement in terms of customer experience combined with better security and better fraud? I mean, what kind of activity between now and the deadline will you perform so that at some point you'll know, yeah, we know this works?
Well, I guess a couple of things there. Firstly, we're undertaking some pilot exercises at the moment to test those things against some criteria which broadly match up against those three things. So we're doing that. It's probably going to take another kind of 4 to 6 weeks, I think, and then we're hoping to sort of really reach a decision or a conclusion on that before we get into kind of the change freeze period towards the end of this year. And I guess the other important element of that is the outcome of the PSD2 consultation, which is currently in progress with the FCA, part of which will look at inherence and the definition of inherence, which will enable us to fully appraise whether these solutions are compliant with the regulations. So that guidance is going to be an important factor in that process, as well as the kind of more technical side of it.
Absolutely, and I look forward to seeing the results of that. So we've been talking about compliance quite a lot during this, and of course that is a very large element of it. But at what point do you think organization will be able to look at authentication strategies as opposed to compliance strategies for strong customer authentication?
Well, I think I think as I say, we've as the industry has gone through a series of, I guess, waypoints and deadlines through the last few years, and has I guess internal plans have largely been focused around meeting those deadlines that have been set, and we've right now I guess focus is on those two kind of key outstanding areas which we've already discussed. As I say, other each organization probably has specific other challenges as well, but those are the two main ones. I think post the enforcement date, we might see a period of, I guess, more strategic thinking after that. So if you take the behavioral biometrics use case as a case in point, it may be the first time an organization's used behavioral biometrics to solve this problem, but it has a much wider potential in terms of not just e-commerce payments, but across digital services and things like that as well. So I think thinking about all of those journeys together is perhaps something that organizations haven't yet done, because of the changes have been phased across a number of years for different areas of strong customer authentication. So I think post the deadline, there'll be an opportunity to sort of take a step back and say, well, what have we done, and how do we make more use of some of the new technologies and services that have been introduced as a result of responding and meeting these regulations, and thinking more broadly about the value that can be given to organizations and their customers through the use of some of these technologies. So I would expect to see that focus start to switch to that once we get past that March date.
Absolutely. So we look forward to that, and there's not long to go now. So I'm afraid we're nearly out of time, but before we take questions from the audience, Dave, one final tip for our listeners?
Let's work together.
Absolutely.
For the next 6 months.
It's good to talk. So thank you, Dave. You've been a fabulous guest. We'll take questions from the audience now. This was Dave Gordon, Senior Product Owner at Nationwide Building Society, and me, Neira Jones. Hello. So thank you, Dave, for being such an excellent guest. It is a fascinating subject. It is now time to take questions from the audience. So we'll wait for that. I have a question for you before we do that. I absolutely love your closing remarks about working together. So in a perfect world, what would you recommend as the next steps for card issuers and e-commerce in general?
I think the key thing is, we've been working towards ramping up for a few months now and made some progress. I think what we need to establish most of all is some better kind of feedback loops between the different organizations involved, so it can really understand challenges that are emerging, that are affecting either customers or organizations, so that we can really work on them together where that's necessary, where that's going to give the right outcome. And I think establishing those feedback loops and those communication channels in a bit more of a robust way than has been the case so far would benefit everybody involved.
Communication. That's always the thing with large endeavors. So switching to technology, of course, behavioral biometrics is actually a fascinating use of technology. And we mentioned earlier on in the interview that there are many technologies that can be used, and I'm sure you've been involved in such extensive evaluation exercises. So could you tell us what other technologies did you consider aside from behavioral biometrics for inherence, which was the real sticky point in all of this?
Yeah, so I think it's probably interesting question. I think largely this, nearly 2 years ago, actually, so 18 months, but probably nearly 2 years ago, there was a lot of collaboration across the industry around how we make one-time passcode authentications compliant. And a lot of the consultation and the suggestions around using behavioral biometrics and exploring it as an option was done as a collective industry exercise, and a lot of guidance was given from the industry around navigation of that path. I think so from our perspective, it's probably less around inherence technologies as alternatives to behavioral biometrics, and more about other alternatives within the bounds of the regulations. So we looked quite extensively at what options we have in terms of using a knowledge factor instead of as an inherence factor to go with the one-time passcodes. So it's really it came down to analysis and decisions around those two options, bringing it back to the balance that we talked about before around between compliance and maintaining a good customer experience. So that's really that was the choice that we ended up making, working with the industry, and ended up that our view we came to was that knowledge would have too many compromises in terms of the experience. So that's why we focused on behavioral biometrics, and we made we went through an extensive process in terms of understanding different suppliers available and different options that would give us, and also how those suppliers would take the challenge of actually making this work, because it's this has not been used as an authentication factor before. Behavioral biometrics is largely around fraud detection. So can it be used to actually authenticate an individual and meet a standard of proof that's required to be to meet the regulations? So that was really how we came to that decision.
Thanks for that. So what would you say was your biggest challenge throughout this program?
Well, there's been several. I think the biggest one actually was I think the biggest one is still ahead of us, and we've talked a lot about that in this webinar, but so I won't go over that ground again. I think aside from the challenge that's facing us now in terms of rolling out all the rules and getting all transactions compliant, I think the biggest challenge we've faced up to now has been making sure that as we rolled out and created authentication options through the 3D Secure protocol, that all of our customers had access to ideally two or more of those, but at least one. We started with a position of where we did some analysis of our customer base and our cardholder base, and there was a significant gap in terms of the number of people who had access to specific options at that time. So we needed to go through an extensive communication process with our customers to ensure that they were ready and prepared for the change, but also they had access to authentication methods and understood how to use them. That was a process which we planned for over a long period of time and executed a communications plan over a period of about 9 to 12 months, preparing for the point in time when we released all of our authentication options, which was around about March time this year. So that was really probably the biggest challenge, making sure that we didn't leave people behind and didn't cause bad experiences by introducing those new options for them.
Excellent. So just quickly reminding our audience that continue to post the questions so that they can flow whilst we have Dave with us today. So Dave, let's jump in our time machine. It's now April 2022. earlier on in the interview, you said that, we can, once we get the compliance deadline passed, that's when we're going to be able to think more strategically about authentication, customer experience, and all those good things. So April 2022 at Nationwide, if we look into the future, what are you going to be doing, if you're able to share, or what do you think the industry is going to be doing?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges to overcome before then, as we talked about. I think the main thing would be making sure that we probably consolidate a little bit more. So having a bit, we've very much looked at it on a kind of channel by channel basis so far. Payments separate to our digital banking services. So I think there's a period of thinking around what opportunities there might be there for consolidation and a bit more joined up in terms of some of those experiences that we've delivered over the last 2 or 3 years. So I think that would probably be the first thing I think we need to think about in terms of optimizing those solutions. We've introduced quite a lot of choice into the process of authentication through our channels. I think it would be a time to take a step back and understand which of those processes are most favored by our customers, and therefore which ones perhaps become more of our focus in terms of improving and making better use of over a longer period of time.
That's great. Consolidation, I like it, especially as the industry itself is consolidating, as we keep seeing the bank rails kind of almost merging with the card rails, and now we're starting to talk more and more about open finance. So you mentioned, consolidation across your digital channels and everything else. And with everything that's happening in the industry, will you be, next year or whenever, looking at other product? I mean, talking about insurance and anything else you might have in your portfolio. Will that be part of it?
I think probably less about products and more about experience touch points. So authentication is not just about digital. We have a big branch network. We have a big obviously customer facing contacts, customer support team. So thinking about authentication and trying to make sure that experiences are joined up. And you get the same experience, where however you choose to deal with us as an organisation is important. So I think it's probably less about product by product and more about thinking about the different touch points and trying to make experiences a bit more consistent for customers.
That's fabulous. I think it is a very rare thing to hear a financial services institution actually saying they're putting the customer first and putting their money where their mouth is. So thank you for that, Dave. I look forward to see how Nationwide progresses with this. I think we're shortly going to run out of time with the questions, and I thank BioCatch for organizing this interview. It's been my privilege to host you, Dave. Would you like to leave our audience with a final tip? Another tip.
I say it again, work together. It's really, really important. We're at a critical stage, and the next 6 months are really important for everybody. So I'm going to plug that one again, I think.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for being a great guest. It's been my privilege to host this webinar organized by BioCatch. Thank you very much. Don't forget to visit the site.